On May 8, 1945, London was celebrating like the war was finally over. Germany had surrendered, the streets were packed, and Winston Churchill came out to wave at a huge crowd chanting his name. For nearly 6 years, Britain had been fighting Nazi Germany. Now Germany was beaten, and Churchill looked like the man who had brought Britain through it. If Britain had held an election that afternoon, you would probably have expected him to win without much trouble. Instead, less than 2 months later, British voters threw his government out. Labour won 393 seats, Clement Attlee became Prime Minister, and Churchill was gone. Which sounds pretty unbelievable. People had just been cheering Churchill in the streets. So what changed? The strange thing is, not much changed about Churchill. People still respected him. The bigger change was what they wanted the government to do. For 6 years, Britain had been running almost everything around the war. Factories made tanks and aircraft. Workers built military bases instead of normal houses. Food and clothing were rationed. Cities had been bombed, and new house building had almost stopped. That was not because Churchill had decided ordinary life did not matter. Britain was fighting for survival, so the war came first. But winning the war did not magically make all those problems disappear. Once Germany surrendered, millions of soldiers were preparing to come home. Families still needed houses, factories had to switch back to normal production, and people wanted to know what kind of life they were coming back to. For Churchill, that was an awkward moment. He had become Prime Minister because Britain needed someone who could stand up to Hitler. And on that job, he had done extremely well. But Hitler was now gone. Labour looked at the country and basically said, "Good, we won the war. Now we need to fix the place." Its campaign talked about things people could see in their own lives: jobs, housing, social security, healthcare. Its manifesto summed it up as food, work, and homes. And there was a simple argument behind all of it. During the war, Britain had somehow managed to organize an entire country around one goal. Factories could be told what to make. Workers and materials could be sent where they were needed. Food could be rationed. Huge amounts of money could be spent because winning the war came first. So Labour asked a pretty obvious question. If the government could organize all of that to build bombers, why could it not organize itself to build houses? That argument was much easier to make in 1945 than it would have been before the war. People had just spent years watching the government plan, control, and organize almost everything. And Britain had won. Labour also had another advantage. It was not coming into the election as some completely untested group that had been sitting on the sidelines for 6 years. Labour had been inside Churchill's government. When Churchill became Prime Minister in 1940, he formed a wartime coalition and brought Labour into it. Clement Attlee eventually became his Deputy Prime Minister. So while Churchill was leading the war, Attlee had been sitting right there helping run the country. That made it much harder for Churchill to say, "You cannot trust these people with government." They had already been in government, and in fact, this was one of the weirdest things about the election. Churchill was running against a man who had spent the last few years working for him. And Labour could take that experience into the campaign and say, "We helped run Britain during the war. Now let us run it during the peace." Churchill also had a problem that was not really his own fault. He was much more popular than the Conservative Party. Churchill had spent years warning that Hitler was dangerous, so people knew he had not always agreed with the politicians who had tried to avoid confrontation with Germany before the war. But the Conservative Party still carried all that baggage. People remembered the 1930s, they remembered unemployment, they remembered poverty in parts of the country, and they remembered Neville Chamberlain and appeasement. So people could look at Churchill and think, great war leader, and then look at the Conservative Party and think, I am still not sure I want these people running the next 10 years. Polls had actually been showing this before the war was even over. Churchill stayed very popular, but Labour was already ahead of the Conservatives. That was not really a contradiction. People trusted Churchill to fight Hitler. They did not automatically trust his party to fix housing, jobs, and the economy after Hitler was gone. Churchill tried to fight back by making Labour look dangerous. During the campaign, he went on the radio and warned that a socialist government trying to control so much of the economy might eventually need what he called some form of Gestapo to enforce its plans. That was a pretty dramatic attack. It was also a strange one, because the leader of this supposedly dangerous Labour Party was Clement Attlee, the quiet little man who had just spent years sitting beside Churchill in the wartime government. Attlee went on the radio the next night and basically pointed that out. There was Churchill, the war leader, and there was Churchill, the conservative politician. You could admire one without voting for the other. That speech did not suddenly destroy Churchill's campaign. Labour had already been ahead for a long time, but it showed how different the two campaigns had become. Churchill was still warning people about danger. Labour was talking about what kind of house you were going to live in when the war was over. Churchill was warning about socialism. Labour was talking about whether returning soldiers would have jobs. And that was the problem. Churchill was still strongest on the question Britain had spent 6 years asking: who can get us through this war? But a lot of voters were already asking something else. What happens when the war is over? Britain voted on July 5th. Then everyone had to wait. Millions of servicemen were still overseas, so counting their votes took weeks. While Britain waited for the result, Churchill traveled to Potsdam in Germany to meet Harry Truman and Joseph Stalin. Attlee went with him. So when the conference began, Churchill was still sitting at the table as Prime Minister with Attlee nearby. Then the election result finally came in. Labour had won by a landslide. Churchill resigned. Attlee became Prime Minister. And when the British delegation went back to Potsdam, Truman was still there, Stalin was still there, and Britain had simply changed the man sitting across from them. That is probably the easiest way to understand what happened. Britain did not suddenly turn against Churchill. People knew exactly what he had done during the war. But the war had taken over the country for 6 years, and once it was ending, all the things people had been waiting for came rushing back to the front. Houses, jobs, healthcare, a normal life. Churchill had been exactly the man Britain wanted when the biggest problem was Hitler. But by the summer of 1945, Hitler was no longer the biggest problem. And once the job changed, enough British voters decided to change the man doing it.